Welcome to Feminism Today, everyone. I'm Sophia Johnson in New York. At the signing of the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act last spring, President Joe Biden called attention to the lack of reliable data on hate crimes, saying it has long contributed to an incomplete understanding of the scope of the issue and the tools needed to address it. Phi Nguyễn knows all about the data on hate crimes against Asian Americans. She is executive director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice, the Atlanta chapter, the first and only non-for-profit legal advocacy organization dedicated to protecting the civil rights of Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders in Georgia and the Southeast. Phi Nguyễn, welcome to Feminism Today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Asian Americans have faced a dramatic spike in violence throughout the pandemic. The organization Stop AAPI Hate documented over 6,600 hate incidents from March 2020 to March 2021. And leaders said the true numbers is much higher than what is actually reported. So high praise for this legislation, but calls for provisions to mitigate anti-Asian rhetoric. What do you think are some of the root causes of systemic racism and oppression for the community?
Thank you for the question. I think the biggest root cause is white supremacy and the way that it manifests in a lot of different structures. I think we saw it manifested certainly at a national dialogue level when Asian Americans were scapegoated for the COVID-19 pandemic. Mm-hmm. But we've seen throughout history other examples of Asian Americans being scapegoated and treated as the other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, President Biden has said that the law directs the U.S. Department of Justice to fund initiatives aimed at encouraging better reporting of hate crimes with special grants for local law enforcement agencies and community groups. Your organization combines civil rights litigation with other strategies to expand legal protections for marginalized communities and to advocate against unjust, oppressive laws and policies. Why focus on the areas of immigrant justice and voting rights?
I think the focus on voting rights is because the right to vote is the right, I think, that underpins so many of our other civil rights. And it's a great equalizer. In our country, your vote, no matter who you are or where you came from, your one vote is at least theoretically supposed to count just as much as anybody else's vote.
Right.
And so that is something that we believe is sacred and that is necessary for our communities to be represented and to have the type of representation that is actually going to listen to and fight for our communities. And we work at the intersection of immigrant justice and voting rights. We see a lot of laws that try to exclude Asian Americans and other immigrants from becoming citizens or from fully participating in the democratic process. And so we believe it is critical to fight for immigrant justice and voting rights. And in fact, the history of Asian Americans in this country and the suppression of Asian American votes has been historically tied to citizenship.
Yeah, that's so true. Now, a recent survey by NPR, National Public Radio, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and Harvard's Chan School of Public Health indicates that 1 in 4 Asian households in the U.S. still report fearing physical attacks and threats because of their race. The survey was taken between August the 2nd and September 7th of 2021. As the Delta coronavirus variant swept the country and showed that these households were reporting fear and really physical safety. What do you think this data tells us even 2 years into the pandemic?
I think it tells us that despite any, I think after the March 16th shootings in Atlanta, then there was a lot of attention on the AAPI community and the increase in anti-Asian violence. And I think what some of the data shows us is that even when there's not a national light being shown on some of the issues that Asian Americans experience, that fear is still there, and that the struggles that our communities have are there and will continue to be there even when we're not necessarily on stage talking about those things. So it's something that we need to address, and we need to address on a systemic level.
And I also understand that in addressing these issues on a systemic level, that your chapter actually did a lot of organizing work leading up to the last federal elections. Asian American First, we should say, are diverse socioeconomically in regards to religion, country of origin, but they did vote overwhelmingly Democratic in the last election. One, why is that? And what would you say in this midterm year are the pressing issues as people head to the ballots?
Sure. And I will just preface my response to your question by saying that Advancing Justice Atlanta is a nonpartisan organization. So all of our voter engagement and voter outreach is done in a nonpartisan manner. We don't ask voters to vote a certain way. We just try to give them the information that they need and educate them on the issues at stake so that they can make those choices on their own.
Okay.
That said, I think one of the reasons why Asian Americans have, as a whole, and to your point, we are a diverse swath of ethnicities. And so different communities look differently. But I would say on the whole, I think one of the reasons why Asian Americans have trended more Democratic is because I think that the Republican Party has become increasingly anti-immigrant and xenophobic and a lot more open about, frankly, some of the white supremacy and racism that different institutions have been peddling. And so I think that has in turn, pushed Asian Americans further left.
Let's stick to this point for a moment longer. What would you say, because you guys were actively involved in community outreach and engagement, what was the playbook for how to reach voters that traditionally had generally not been engaged in politics? You guys were absolutely successful. And I'm just wondering, as we move into this midterm season, what was the playbook?
I think our playbook has been that we've been on the ground for years mobilizing Asian American voters. And so I think that we were able to get on the national stage last year because of sort of the historic nature of the elections that we had in Georgia and the historic outcomes of those elections.
Mm-hmm.
I think all of the sort of victories and turnout that people saw nationally in Georgia are a result of years of on the ground organizing by groups like Advancing Justice Atlanta, as well as groups who are working with Black voters, Latinx voters, and other voters of color. And in terms of, so I guess one thing I would say is the playbook is year-round integrated voter engagement, where we're not just touching our community members that during these high-profile elections and only during election cycles, but we are making sure that we are in communication with them year-round and engaging them in multiple ways.
Nice. Now, Indian Americans are the largest Asian American group in Georgia. Was Kamala Harris a factor in turning them out?
That's a good question. And I think that the answer is yes, that there's always, I think whenever you have an elected official or a candidate rather, who who represents a marginalized identity, then that is going to drive some turnout, because people understand that it's important to have people who look like you represent you, and that they're, more likely to be able to understand issues that are close to your community. So do I think that had impact? I'm sure that it did. I can't say how much impact it had, but I definitely think that seeing people who look like us and understand the communities that we come from is an important aspect in turning out voters.
Nice. Now, President Joe Biden carried Georgia with less than 13,000 votes during the last federal election, a tiny margin made possible in part by historic turnout among Asian American and Pacific Islanders. It's the first time in nearly 30 years that Georgia voters chose a Democratic president. Can we talk a little bit about, if there are any sort of lessons for lessons learned in the last season of elections and moving into the midterm, and in particular, moving into Stacey Abrams' bid for gubernatorial representation, her campaign?
If you're asking me to say what lessons candidates should learn, I can start there. And I think one of the lessons that can be learned from the outcome in Georgia is that Asian American voters cannot be ignored by candidates. When elections are won on or lost by such slim margins, then every vote on the table matters.
Sure.
And so I think historically, candidates on both sides of the aisle have not done a great job of doing outreach to Asian American voters. And honestly, I think part of that is because, we are such a diverse coalition and political group that the outreach and how to do it thoughtfully can be tricky. And so I don't think that candidates in the two major parties have historically invested a lot of time and energy and money and resources into doing that outreach. And so the outreach disproportionately tends to fall on community organizations like ours.
Yeah.
But I hope that a lesson that comes out of 2020 and 2021 is that the investment is worth it.
Women make up a majority, some 53% of Georgia's registered voters. However, according to the Pew Research Center report in 2020, gender differences are larger among Black and Latino voters than among white and Asian voters. Why do you think that is? And two, can Abrams count?
I mean, if you're asking me, can she count on them to vote for her? I think, again, we do nonpartisan work, but if the statistics show that Democrats or that Asian Americans vote more Democratic, then I do think that Stacey Abrams can count on at least some of the Asian American women, those Asian American women votes. However, I don't think that any candidate can afford to take any of those votes for granted, right?
Now, you alluded to this a little bit earlier. March 16th, a white gunman allegedly shot and killed 8 people in Atlanta spas, 6 of them Asian women. The massacre has really opened the public's eyes about public hate. Asian American activists are hoping to harness the momentum and turn it into sustained action in terms of political engagement. Does this incident and the wave of Asian American activism feel like a turning point for you?
I think it does feel like a turning point in some ways, yes. I think that the increase in anti-Asian violence, or this most recent wave of it, and sort of the national attention shown to the issue has helped to, unfortunately, I mean, I hate that this is the trigger for it, but I do think that it has led to increased engagement across the Asian American communities as we sort of have, I think, a reckoning with the fact that anti-Asian racism is alive and well, and that we are vulnerable to white supremacy just as much as, you know, other communities of color. And I think it has been an opportunity for the Asian American community to really examine our history and examine our own relationship to white supremacy and the ways in which we sometimes are acting as the perpetrators of that against other communities of color. So it's an opportunity to sort of examine our own hands and then to really understand our history and the ways that our histories and oppressions intersect with or diverge from other communities of color.
Right. I'm wondering if we can explore that for a little bit. This idea of examining the community's history, right? And it even feels like maybe you're digging a little bit into this idea of the model citizen, right? This idea that we're model, we're doing the right thing, and so we don't have to worry, we're safe. But what does examination really look like in this context? What would what do you really help viewers understand what examination, this introspective experience would look like?
Well, I think for one, what you're mentioning, the model minority myth, is something that has been used historically to drive a wedge basically between Asian Americans and the Black community. And I think it's a dangerous myth that Asian Americans sometimes have bought into themselves to sort of distance themselves from other communities of color. And so if we're buying into that myth, then we then become either complicit in, or we are, I guess, aggressors of this white supremacy. And so I think that forcing us to sort of examine our history and learn it, you know, I think about my own education, attending public schools in Georgia, and I don't really remember getting a very robust history lesson about the history of oppressions of Asian Americans in the US, or the history of activism by Asian Americans against, you know, racial inequity in the country. And so to understand that history and to look at things like the Chinese Exclusion Act, to look at things like Japanese American incarceration during World War II, to examine what happened after 9/11 and the way that Muslim and South Asian and Muslim appearing people were targeted in the aftermath of 9/11. I think it just forces us to really, I guess, draw a line throughout history where sometimes, you know, when it's convenient, we're treated as the model minority, right? And other times when there is fear, where there needs to be a scapegoat for an issue, then we can very easily become the enemy and the target as well. And we need to reckon with that.
Yeah. Now, Asian Americans come from many countries with many languages and cultures, as we've been talking about. How does your organization grapple or deal with this challenge?
It is definitely a challenge, but one of the ways that we grapple with it is we do our civic engagement and voter registration and get out the vote work in multiple languages. And so we think that that's a critical component of doing the outreach. And we also really strive to have, like when we're sending canvassers out, we think it's really important to have people who are connected to the community be the ones who are the messenger. And so if you look at our staff, we have a broad range of, I think, different Asian American ethnicities who are represented. And so we're able to sort of understand the nuances between different communities. And we also work in partnership with other organizations and community members so we can really understand what some of those differences look like.
Can we talk a little bit about intersectionality and the extent to which your organization partners and works with people of color, across the board, any types of, engagement, strategic engagement with the Latino or the African American community? How much of that really happens on the ground in terms of community outreach?
Sure. I think intersectionality is a really important component of our work and has been since we started the organization in 2010. Certainly with our policy advocacy work, we are working with community leaders from the Black community and also from the Latinx community. And we really are motivated to continue to build this multiracial, multi-ethnic coalition of voters, and not just voters, but engaged citizens. And I mean citizens broadly, not just to mean people who have recognized legal status in this country, but to really push for changes that will allow all communities of color to thrive in Georgia. So it's a central component of our work in our policy work, and sort of understanding the way that the criminal legal system also has impacted different Asian American ethnicities, or the way that the criminal legal system is really tied to the massive deportation and detention system that we have. So helping to draw those connections for our communities and for other communities is critical to our work, and we certainly strive to be good allies and to not allow elected officials to draw a wedge between our communities when we're looking at different issues that impact our community differently than it impacts the Black community or the Latinx community. I would say with our voter engagement work, it's the same thing. I mean, at the end of we Asian Americans have grown significantly in population in the state of Georgia, but in the grand scheme of things, we're still a pretty small percentage of the electorate. Tiny but mighty. But we understand that we have to work in coalition with other voters to really be able to have sort of that people power that's needed.
Yeah. Now, 3 white men who chased and murdered 25-year-old Black jogger Ahmaud Arbery in South Georgia were recently sentenced to life in prison, with 2 having no chance of parole. I don't want you to speak necessarily on the case because that's a separate matter, but what do you think is the best strategy to protect civil and human rights, the best strategy for sustained change in terms of the tensions that we're seeing?
I think that our strategies have to be, nimble and multi-pronged. And so at our organization, we do civic engagement and organizing, and we do policy advocacy. We do I already said civic. We do, we provide direct legal services to immigrants, particularly those who are at risk of deportation. And then we do impact litigation in the areas of voting rights and immigrant justice. And so the reason why we engage those 4 strategies is because I think it's needed to actually be able to effectuate systemic change. Then we have to be able to address some of the immediate attacks, and we have to be able to address some of the, immediate attacks and immediate needs of our communities at the same time, while we build long-term systemic change and ask our community members to help us. So I think it needs to be a people-powered movement.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, we're building that power and asking for people to be part of that movement. We can't ignore some of the more immediate needs that they have facing them, like the need for relief from COVID-19, for
Yeah.
example,
Yeah.
or the need to have legal representation because a family member is at risk for deportation.
Right. I'm curious about how social media is being sort of used in this time, in this era of a global pandemic, and how effective has that been in terms of outreach and community engagement?
I think it's definitely a challenge for everybody who's doing work out in the community right now. Social media definitely, has its power in that it enables you to reach millions of people at the same time. On the flip side, it's also a peddler of misinformation. So that's sort of the other side to it. I think I think that our outreach has to be a mixture of both. I mean, I think most organizers will tell you that nothing really beats the on the ground face to face conversations that you can have at the door. I
Mhm.
think that's critical to our work. At the same time, because of the pandemic, we've at times had to pivot entirely to a virtual model, and then other times we do hybrid work. So I at the end of the day, I don't think that there's anything that can replace, face-to-face conversations, but social media helps. And I think that one thing that we are seeing too is groups just becoming more and more creative with the way that they do outreach virtually, because we have to become more creative to reach more people.
Phi Nguyen, thank you so much for joining us this week.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
And that's it for our program today. Remember, you can follow me and the show on Instagram or Twitter. Thank you so much for watching Feminism Today on Free Speech TV. Join us again next week.